Do you ever feel like you're chasing a moving target, or like being good enough always feels like it's just out of reach? I get it. Growing up with a father who was an addict, losing a parent at a young age, and battling obsessive-compulsive disorder throughout my life has taught me much about shame, guilt, and always trying to be good enough. But what if being good enough is a myth? What if your worth is not something to chase or try to measure up to? This is the Enough Effect podcast, a space to rewrite the narrative, share stories, and discover the power of being you exactly as you are. I think we're rolling. So, hi. If you're new here, which all of you are because this is my first episode, my name is Abby Tapilos, and welcome to the Enough Effect podcast. I started this podcast because I know on a very intimate level what it's like to live a life where you feel like you are not and you never will be enough. About a year ago, when I started feeling this way, in a way that was crippling, if you will, I was spending hours a day doing things I didn't quite understand, distracting me at work. I felt so anxious all the time. I was getting horrible tension headaches, and I just knew that something wasn't quite right, and it was continuing to get worse over time. And so I started therapy for like the 6th time in my life. I felt so dumb because I was just like, okay, so hi, I think I'm just a crippling perfectionist. I don't know what else to tell you, but I think I need help. And as I talked with her over and over and over again, one day she said to me, I think this is something a little bit bigger, and I think that you have obsessive-compulsive disorder. And at first I was like, girl, I don't wash my hands a lot, so I don't know what you're talking about. But that was because myself and really no one else around me even knew anything about OCD. And that is why I'm here. So if you have OCD, or someone you know has OCD, or if you think you might have OCD, you are in the right place, because we're going right to the basics and right to the bare bones. And this is going to apply no matter what theme your OCD attaches to. So let's dive right into it. Number one, the very beginning of what we call the OCD cycle is when you get an intrusive thought. This phrase in particular is used a lot in an incorrect way. People will say things on the internet like, oh, the intrusive thoughts won, and they like booked a ticket to a vacation or something. And I don't fault them, again, because a lot of people just don't know about OCD. But an intrusive thought is around the theme of the person who has OCD's obsession. And so for me, I struggle with something called scrupulosity OCD. It's one of my themes. So I get a lot of intrusive thoughts about religion and about if I have wronged God, or if I'm doing enough in the sight of God, if I've sinned or repented correctly. And those thoughts lead you to the second part of the OCD cycle, which is intense anxiety. And that anxiety is directly linked to something. And I think that that's a big common misunderstanding with OCD, is that it's specifically just only an anxiety disorder. And it makes sense when people say that, because a key component of the cycle and of OCD is anxiety. But because of the unique nature of the OCD cycle that the person goes through millions of times a day, it's not just an anxiety disorder. That anxiety is directly linked to the obsessions and the intrusive thought. Once that anxiety spikes, there is something that the OCD sufferer can do to make that anxiety go down or to dissipate, and that is to do a compulsion, which is our third step in the OCD cycle. And compulsions are different for each theme, but they exist in pretty much every type of OCD unless you have just your O or just obsession OCD. So if we go back to my example of struggling with scrupulosity OCD, say I'm sitting here and I get a thought that I didn't repent correctly for a sin that I had committed. And then I'm going to start feeling really anxious about that. And my compulsion would be to go and repent for that sin again and again and again. And I can get caught in that cycle of repeating and repeating, because unfortunately, after the compulsion is completed, we're at our third step. We're going to go to our fourth step, which is a temporary reduction in anxiety. You feel better because you did something that your OCD wanted you to do. It's like if somebody feels like their hands are dirty, and if they don't wash them, something bad will happen. They wash them, they feel better, but it's all an illusion, because you feel better for a little bit. And I could get the exact same thought in about 20 seconds that I actually didn't repent correctly. Then I'm gonna get anxious and repent again and feel better, and then worry about if I did it right, and go around and around and around and around and around. And so that is what every person, with the exception of pure OCD, who has OCD goes through so many times per day. And we can apply that cycle to any theme, any type of obsession. You just replace whatever goes in the intrusive thought box and whatever goes into the compulsion box. This cycle is so incredibly important for everyone to understand, especially if you're thinking you might have OCD based on content you've seen online, because that's what OCD is. If you can't identify, and you may need a professional's help to identify how that cycle is going, because a lot of the times it is unconscious, there's something else going on besides OCD. And it's so important as well for people to understand this, because because OCD is such a misunderstood disorder and people are throwing around things using OCD as an adjective or saying my OCD is coming out kind of as the punchline of a joke, there's people who go through the cycle and who experience real trauma and real pain from the disorder. So this cycle is what differentiates people who have persistent worries and anxiety from those who have OCD. And I must make an important disclaimer here. Just because you've gone through this cycle a few times in your life does not mean you have OCD. People who don't have OCD can relate to what somebody with OCD goes through, but they can't relate to the persistence of it. When I'm in my support group for OCD or in my therapy, the therapist often doesn't have OCD, but they will say, you don't have to have OCD to know what it's like to get intrusive thoughts or to feel driven to do a compulsion. The difference is, are you consistently going through that cycle and have trouble getting out of it? In addition to the OCD cycle, OCD is also characterized by doubt. The OCD mind is a doubting mind. It will doubt anything and everything. I can see my car out the window that's behind the camera. I could turn around and my mind would be like, I don't think the car was actually there. You better go check. And that's why people get stuck locking doors a million times, washing hands a million times, repenting a million times, whatever the theme might be. The second thing that OCD is characterized by is an intolerance to uncertainty. The mind is always trying to find certainty. You're trying to find certainty that your hands are clean enough, that you're right with God, that you did that task in the exact right way. And that's why you also get stuck in that loop over and over again. So alas, we have officially discussed what OCD is and the characteristics of OCD. And these are so important, like I mentioned, not only for breaking stigma, accurate diagnoses, but also for providing accurate treatment. When I was first diagnosed with OCD, my therapist told me that according to the National Institutes of Health, it can take an average of 17 years for someone to be accurately diagnosed. And that was true for me. I started experiencing OCD symptoms before I was 8 years old, and I was not diagnosed until I was 27. But there was good news when I was diagnosed, because once you understand what's happening in your brain, you can recognize I'm having an intrusive thought and I'm gonna get anxious soon. But the key is not do the compulsion, because if I don't do the compulsion, it's impossible for me to progress in the cycle. And I can rewire and reteach my brain that those compulsions are doing nothing except trapping me in a loop. That's oversimplifying, I know, because it's a lot harder than it sounds if you have OCD, you know. All in all, the message is that there is hope. There is hope for people who have OCD, because for many like me, you can be floundering in what you think is a perfectionistic personality or a quirky adjective, like a lot of people say. But once you understand that cycle and get the help you need to break out of it, you can live masterfully with OCD. It's still gonna come up, it's still gonna bug you sometimes, but you're gonna be able to understand its tricks and do everything that you know how to do so that you can stay out of that cycle and regain control of your life. On this podcast, we're gonna be talking about everything I've learned on my journey of how to master living with OCD so that you can stop listening to those thoughts in your head and do what you want to do and live a life according to what you value. And I know that that's real and that that's true. As the new year has begun and I looked back, 2024 was the first year of my life where I knew I had OCD the entire year, and I dedicated so much time and energy into understanding the disorder, how it works for me and my brain, and what I can do to take control back in my life and live a life that I want to live. And I've gotten very emotional as I've contemplated that and understood that I have made progress, and I don't have to talk to my therapist every single week anymore in order to stay above water. And I'm not as afraid of my thoughts, and when anxiety comes up, I don't panic and figure out how I have to get rid of it. That's why I'm so passionate about this podcast and helping as many people as I can. So whether you have OCD or just anxiety or just negative thoughts, or you just want some positive energy in your life, I hope you'll stick around. Thank you for listening to the Enough Effect podcast. If you enjoyed listening, it would mean the world to me if you would subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment your favorite thing from today's episode. Plus, don't forget to hit up my social media at abstabs, ABSTABBS on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook for daily inspirational content to remind you that you can live a life built upon the resounding belief that being good enough was never an endeavor worth pursuing. Lastly, check out my show notes for any resources mentioned in this episode and my website, where you can find a list of all the ways I would love to work with you. See you next week, and don't forget that you are and always have been more than enough.